ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः. Namaskar, my dear friends. This is video number 12 on Panchadasi of Swami Vidyarnaya-Bharti. This video starts with chapter number 8, elucidation of the immutable, Kutasthatadipa Parkarna. In the Chitradipa, the terms Dharma, Kutastha, Jiva, and Isvara were explained by comparing them to ether at large, pot ether, reflection of ether in the water present in the pot, and reflection of ether in the water particles of the cloud respectively. Dharma and Kutastha are identical in reality, while the Jiva and Isvara are reflections and have no reality of their own. In the Mahavakya, that thou art, the express senses of the words that and thou are the Jiva and Isvara respectively, but their implied senses are the Kutastha and Brahma, between which alone appositional relation is possible. As the final truth of the Vedanta is the identity between the self and Brahma, between the thou and that, the implied senses of the two latter words alone must be recognized. The finite trappings in which the Jiva is clothed must be stripped. The word thou must be freed from its empirical associations. This is possible only when, by secondary implication, the word is understood to mean the Kutastha, the immutable, which is no other than Brahma, the implied sense of the word that. In the Kutastha Dipa, the relation between the immutable and the reflection of intelligence, Chidabhasa, is explained. The Jiva is characterized to be a reflection of the immutable, having no reality of its own. The theory of limitations, Avachedavada, is criticized, and the identity between the immutable and Brahma is asserted. Chidabhasa number 1, part number 1 of chapter 8. Chidabhasa and Brahma intelligence. First, the reflection of intelligence is distinguished from the immutable Brahma through an analysis of external perception. According to the Abhasavada, in an act of perception, there are 4 facts involved. A. The intelligence qualified by the internal organ together with the Chidabhasa is the perceiving agent. B. The intelligence qualified by the mental mode together with the Abhasa reflection is the means of valid knowledge. C. The intelligence limited by adjuncts like pot, etc. is the object intelligence. And D. The reflection of intelligence which is generated by the relation of the mental mode with pot, etc. is the fruit intelligence, phala chetna. If a pot is to be known, there must result in it the reflection of intelligence brought about by the contact of the mental mood with the pot. The intelligence which is in the intellect and which has assumed the form of the pot makes known the pot. But the knownness of the pot is caused by Brahma intelligence. It may then be asked, if the knownness of the pot be due to Brahmana intelligence, what purpose is served by the presence of the intellect? To this objection, the reply is the intellect is the instrument for making the pot known. Prior to the intellectual cognition of the pot is made manifest by Brahmana intelligence, not as known but as a thing unknown. And after the mental mood has come into contact with the pot, the same intelligence manifests the pot as known. Both the statements I know the pot and I do not know the pot have Brahma intelligence as their basis. Let Brahma illumine the unknownness of an object, there being no apparatus of perception. But what part has Brahma to play in the perception of an object? If thus it be asked, we reply, just as Brahma generates the attribute of unknownness in an object which is not perceived, it generates the attribute of knownness in an object which is perceived. It may then be objected that as the instrument of perception is intellectual cognition through the channel of the senses, the intellect alone is sufficient to reveal the object, and that no purpose is served by the abhasa or the reflection and of intelligence. But this is not sound. The intellect which is inert, non-intelligent like the pot etc. is powerless to manifest any object. Let us imagine a wall studded with pieces of mirror. When the rays of the sun are reflected in the mirrors, we may well say that the wall is illumined both by the reflected rays and by the direct rays of the sun. But when there is neither the sun nor the reflection of its rays, though there may be mirrors, the wall is not illumined. Minds are like mirrors, ineffectual in themselves to reveal objects. Reflection is necessary. If the mirror are to manifest the wall, and the sun too is necessary if there is to be reflection at all. It is only that intellect which is endowed with the reflection of intelligence that is able to accomplish the perception of an object. Knownness of a pot means the generation of the fruit, namely the Chidabhasa in that pot. When a mental mood comes into contact with the pot, there is generated in the pot a reflection of intelligence, and it is this reflection that reveals the pot and is called the fruit fla. It cannot be said that Brahma intelligence is the fruit, for even prior to the perception of the object, it existed and will continue to exist when the perceptive process has come to an end. The fruit that is generated in the external objects of perception is not intelligence as such. It is only the reflection of intelligence. It is futile to quote Sureshwara and say that Brahma itself is the fruit. The real intention of Sureshwara is to say that the fruit is similar to Brahma intelligence. Really, the reflection resembles the prototype. What is generated in the object of perception is a reflection of Brahma intelligence, which in turn illumines the object. Thus, it is clear that while Brahma is not the same as the Abhasa, it is yet the basis of the latter. The Abhasa is an appearance of which Brahma is the reality. The distinction between Brahma and the Abhasa may be seen also in the following way. Brahma intelligence illumines the mental moods, the Abhasa and the object of perception, whereas the Abhasa reveals the object alone. Thus the object is illumined by two intelligences, the real intelligence that is Brahma and the reflection that is the Abhasa. First the object is known and then there is the knowledge that the object is known. The latter kind of knowledge is called by the logicians reflective cognition, which is referred to in the Vedanta by the term Brahma intelligence. The perceptive process reveals two clear-cut stages. This is a spot we see and later on we add I know this spot. The first of these statements indicates the activity of the Abhasa and the second points to the fact that Brahma is the basic intelligence which accounts for the knownness of the object. This is the distinction. Then that an analysis of the perceptual process yields. Without the Abhasa, there cannot be the perception of the object, and without Brahma intelligence, there cannot be the generation of the Abhasa, which stands to Brahma as a reflection to its prototype. The distinction between the Abhasa and Brahma is made patent also when we study the case of internal perception. For external perception, there is an object outside which is reached through the channel of the mental mode and revealed by the Abhasa. But in internal perception, there is no object of any kind, and so it may be asked where is the need for an Abhasa, since in inner perception there are no mental modes which have external objects for their sphere. What ground is there for assuming the Abhasa? To this objection, the reply is there are certainly no objects in the case of internal perception, but there are moods like the ego, and there are passions, emotions, etc., like anger, love, hate, which are pervaded by the Chidabhasa. A red hot ball of iron is self-luminous, but it does not illumine any other object. In inner perception, there are no objects to be revealed by the Chidabhasa, but still there are mental modes which it pervades and illumines, just as the fire which pervades the ball of iron illumines the ball alone. The Abhasa pervading the mental modes reveals them. Modes by themselves are inert, but when associated with the Abhasa, they become self-luminous. What the Brahma or Kutastha to do with internal perception? What purpose does the immutable serve? In the case of external perception, it was seen to be the fundamental basis for perception as well as for non-perception of an object. Similarly, with regard to internal perception, it is the funda foundational intelligence which reveals the existence as well as the non-existence of mental modes. The modes are not always existent, they are not to be found in sleep, zone and samadhi, but these states are not empty of content. There is the immutable witness which silently observes all the changing modes and fleeting moments. The presence of modes is made known by the reflection of intelligence, but their absence is revealed by the immutable intelligence. We noticed above the analogy of the wall studded with pieces of mirror. There are reflections of the rays of the sun wherever there are mirrors on the wall, and those portions of the wall where there are mirrors are illumined both by the reflected and the original rays of the sun. But those places on the wall where there are no mirrors and consequently no reflections are illumined by the direct rays of the sun. Similarly, both the existence and the non-existence of mental modes are manifested by the immutable. The interspace and the time interval between any two modes are also illumined by pure intelligence. The presence of modes is more luminous than their absence, because while the latter is manifested by one intelligence with the immutable, the former is illumined by two intelligences, namely the immutable and the reflection. The illumination of the mood by two intelligences is intelligible, for just like the pot which is also illumined by two intelligences, the modes are inert and cannot manifest themselves without their association with the abhasha. But there is this difference between an external object like the pot and an internal mode like the ego. While we can legitimately speak of a pot as known or as unknown, we cannot do so in the case of the modes. As the modes are as the modes are the instruments of knowledge, they cannot apprehend themselves. While they lead to knowledge, they cannot be turned on themselves. An examination of external and internal perception has given us the truth that there are two intelligences, one of which is the original and the other a reflection. Though both share the character of intelligence, they are not the same. While the one is subject to mutations and mutilations, the other is immutable and eternal. The Chidabhasa is circumscribed by the wheel of life and death. It is a reflection having no reality of its own. The Kutastha, on the contrary, is unchanging, eternal, flawless intelligence. The perception of old have defined the Kutastha as the witness of the mind and its modifications. Scriptures declare the immutable to be existence, knowledge, and bliss. In the Upadesa, Sri Sankara distinguishes the Kutastha from the Abhasha. He compares the latter to the reflections of a face in the mirror and former to the original countenance. Part 2 of chapter number 8 of Panchadasi. Limitation theory criticized. The Avachhada The Avacheda Devadin believes that there is no need for assuming the Abhasha over and above the intellect. The immutable defined by the intellect is the jiva. Just as we say that the pot ether moves when there is a movement of the pot, we can explain the movement of the jiva as based on the movement of the mind. When it is possible to account for the migrations and misery of the jiva through the mere limitations due to the adjunct, namely the intellect, it is it is prolix to assume the abhasha. This objection urged by the avichheda within is not sound. If mere limitations be the cause of jivahood, then even the intelligence limited by pot, etc. must be called jiva. The unattached self does not become the jiva by bare definition or limitation. Otherwise, even hills and dales would be jivas and there would be no distinction between intelligent being and non-intelligent things. Nor maybe it said the intellect differs from the pot, etc. in being clear and pure. For as a limitation, it is not truly different from the latter. Rice grains may be measured out either by a vessel made of wood or by one made of metal. In either case, it makes no difference with regard to the measuring out of the rice grains. We do not get more rice in the one than in the other. Similarly, the self is conditioned equally by the intellect and by other adjuncts like thought, etc. There is no distinction whatever in the matter of defining or limiting the self. Thus, if the limitation of the self by the intellect be what constitutes jivahood, then it may be said with equal validity that even such extraneous adjuncts like the pot, etc., convert the self into jiva. The Avechavadin may turn around and say that in the example of measuring out the rice grains, though the two vessels equally and without any difference whatever measure out the grains, there is this distinction between them that while the wooden vessel has no capacity for reflection, the other has. This objection is a contingence of the acceptable, while the non-intelligent objects like the pot, etc., do not have the capacity to reflect, the intellect has, and it is this reflection of intelligence that is called the abhasa. Hence, their limitations of the self does not invest it with jivahood. Where the extraneous adjunct is the mind, there the self is reflected, and this reflection of intelligence is termed the jiva or the abhasa. The abhasa is that which has a limited manifestation, while it is devoid of the characteristics of the prototype, namely the self. It shines like the latter. It is unlike the self since it is subject to attachment and mutation, and it is like the self since it possesses at least limited luminosity. It may be objected that the abhasa has no existence apart from the intellect, nay, that it is identical with the latter just as the pot is identical with clay. But if this objection be true, then the intellect must be non-different from the physical body, since it is seen to be dependent on the latter. The difference between the intellect and the body may be sought to be maintained on the ground that the intellect survives the destruction of the body, and that this is known from the evidence of scripture. But there are also scriptural passages which declare the entry of the reflection of intelligence which is different from the intellect. The opponent may assert that the entry of that intelligence alone which has the intellect for adjunct is possible. But this statement is not in consonance with the evidence of scripture. For the Atriya Upanishad, assuming the entry of the self which is distinct from the intellect, declared that it entered. In the words of the Upanishad, the self observing without me, this psychophysical organism would not be breaks open the middle part of the head, enters through that channel and migrates. But how the non-attached self comes to be attached to the body, we cannot say. Just like creation, the entry of the self cannot be explained, but both the concepts of creation and the self's entry share in the common character of being illusory. The creation of the world and the self-entry which constitutes jivahood are both of them not absolutely real, and they perish when there dawns the light of Brahmana intuition. Part 3 of chapter number 8 of Panchadasi, the immutable self. While pointing out that the Abhasa is not absolutely real, the scripture declares that there is an absolute reality different from the Abhasa. The Kutastha is indestructible and immutable, unattached and eternal. The opponent may quote here a scriptural passage which reads, "This body verily deserted by the jiva dies, but the jiva does not die," and argue that the jiva is not changing and perishing, that it is immutable and permanent. He has not understood the purport of this text. The scriptural passage does not assert that the Jiva is eternal and everlasting, but only that it does not perish with the decay and decomposition of the body. When it has cast out its worn out garment, it puts on a fresh one and finds a new environment. It migrates to other bodies and other worlds. There is a change of habitation, and the Jiva would last so long as ignorance is not dispelled. Absolute eternality is not predicated by the Jiva but only its relative persistence. There crops up here another difficulty. If the Jiva be a perishing impermanent entity, how can there be opposition between it and immutable impartite Brahma? The Mahavakya I am Brahma would be a contradiction in terms. The entire doctrine of the Vedanta, which teaches the identity between the Jiva and Brahma, would be faulty and futile. This objection is ill-founded. There are two kinds of oppositional relation: opposition in the principal sense and opposition through sublation. Between the Kutastha and Brahma, there is opposition in the principal sense. Between the Jiva and Brahma, there is opposition through sublation. The Mahavakya I am Brahma states that I and Brahma are oppositional through sublation. Let us examine the case of illusory perception. When a man mistakes a person for a post and subsequently corrects his wrong notion and says that which seemed to me to be a post is really a person, there is not meant opposition between the post and the person in the principal sense. The notion of the post is sublated, and then there is asserted opposition between the person and what was earlier taken to be a post. The opposition which the Mahavakya intends to convey is analogous to the above illustration. The notion of the Jivahood is sublated, and between Brahma and what is mistakenly cognized as the Jiva, oppositional relation is asserted. This view is lucidly set forth in the Naisa Karma Siddhi by the preceptor Sureswara. In such passages of scriptures as all this is Dharma, we notice that opposition through subtraction alone is what is meant. Surely there cannot be opposition in the principal sense between the world and Brahma. In the in the Vivarna, however, opposition in the sense of sublation is refuted. But in that work, Prakasatman does not intend to say that there is opposition in the principal sense between the finite Jiva and the infinite Brahma. Through secondary implication, he takes the word I to mean the Kutastha and then declares that the Kutastha and Brahma are identical in the principal sense. This is not really in conflict with our view. On the contrary, it is in perfect agreement with it. In the Vivarna as elsewhere, the deeper sense of the world world thou is examined and the identity between the immutable and Brahma is proclaimed. By the Kutastha we mean that intelligence which is the substrate of the illusory reflection, namely the Jiva, which is associated with the body and the senses, the world. Dharma denotes that substrate which is declared in the Vedanta text to be the basis of the illusion of the entire world, just as the world is superimposed on Brahma intelligence, the Jiva reflection, which is but a part of world, is also superimposed on the name Brahma. In the Mahavakya that thou art, the word thou denotes the Kutastha, and the word that Brahma superficially understood. The two words seem to conflict in their denotations. but the difference between them is the result of the difference in superimposition. The word thou signifies the self, whereupon the jiva reflection, which is a part of the world, is superimposed. The word that implies Brahma, wherein the entire world is superimposed. But when unreal superimposition is discarded, the self is seen to be identical with Brahma. If the abhasa is to be proved to be what is superimposed on the self, then it must be shown that the abhasa possesses two aspects, the general nature of the locus and its own particular character of being what is superimposed. In the judgment of illusory perception, this is silver, there are two elements. The word this refers to nacre and the word silver denotes the superimposed illusory silver. In the same way, the abhasa has a twofold character, agency, etc., which are the attributes of the intelligent mark. The superimposed nature of the abhasa and its manifestedness shows the general nature of the self. Hence, the abhasa is an illusory entity. It is non-discrimination that is the cause of illusion. We do not determine what the intellect, the abhasa, and self and the world are. We superimpose on the self what is not the self, and consequently, being deluded, we get involved in the vicious circle of metapsychosis. But he is called the liberated who searches for the truth in the Vedantas and determines the real nature of the self to be different from the intellect, etc. So I stop this video here. Next video will be we'll start with part 3 of chapter 8 of Panchadasi. Thank you for watching this video. Please like, comment and share the video and subscribe the channel. Thanks a lot. Namaskar, my dear friend.